Hi everyone, welcome. When you see labels like this in my wormery, it means the systems are effectively finished. So I've already moved the worms on, or at least the majority of the worms. And sometimes I'll just store the castings in this fashion to let them dry a little bit before being put into storage. Other times I'll keep them out like this so that I can perform some baiting of any straggler worms that might still be in the stuff. And that's really what the intention with this stuff is. These systems were more or less depopulated 12 days ago to launch off 2 new systems. And over the past 12 days, I've aerated the material 4 times. Been back in here to try to stir it around, move the dry stuff down, try to bring the more damp stuff to the surface. And when I'm ready, I'm going to initiate the baiting of the straggler worms in there to reunite them with the majority of the population that was used to launch these 2 new systems down here. I can't call them my newest systems, even though they're only 12 days old, because since the day that these systems were put into service 12 days ago, I've since launched yet another system already. So these are definitely among my youngest, but not my youngest. 12-day-old systems that got 1 feeding that was placed into the bins before the worms even got introduced. I just don't remember whether it was a generous feeding or maybe not all that much, but I did come down with a pretty good sized meal to give them today, and to finally check in on how they're doing after 12 days in their new home. So we're going to get a glove on, get those 2 systems up on the bench, and see how they're coming along. So let's get to work. Besides the typical assortment of frozen foods and coffee, there's also some very, very moldy bread over here. So that's going to be their feeding. But before we press on to giving them their feeding, I'm already noticing the presence of some flying insects in here. And besides not remembering whether I gave them a large or small initial feeding, I also don't remember whether or not I treated the system to prevent flying insect outbreaks. So I'm going to apply a little bit of this Mosquito Dunks right into the system even before we get started, just so I don't forget, and perhaps even at the end. Sometimes I put stuff in at the beginning, sometimes I also put a little bit more at the end. This stuff is it's been helpful in the past to get me out of flying insect outbreak situations. Kind of interesting how these feeding zone indicators are definitely showing some significant signs of wear. But as you saw a moment ago, there's replacement coffee filters coming in with today's feeding. Interesting how this one got so chewed up and this one hardly any. Either way, we're going to use these as supplementary bedding down in the feeding zones. And then we'll have replacement feeding zone indicators to put out here for the wormies. So let's just get this stuff in here right off the bat. And as we stir stuff around, this stuff will make its way all over the place. And I've been pretty generous, so even if I forget to add more later, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. And brand new systems like these, where you can see a lot of castings out on the surface like this, I usually don't assume that the worms just did this over the past 12 days. I'm assuming that this was in large part the material that they were inhabiting when we bought them over from their old home. So I'm not going to get all excited. We're just going to go through the feeding zone, which would have been right down here in the middle, to see if there's any leftovers of the previous feeding. And even if there are, we're not going to be bashful about giving them even more. There's a good number of worms in here, you know. If you haven't been up to date on the latest of my videos, then you might not have seen the video in which these worms were launched into the system, and that's usually the best time to get a good look at how many worms occupy the system. And it's at that time too that I poll the viewers to submit a comment after they see me release the worms into their new home to let me know what they think in terms of how many worms there were. And then what I'll do is I'll average everyone's estimates together, and that'll help us come up with an estimated worm count for all my systems. So I don't have that figure yet for these systems because the video for the launch of these systems only went live on my channel a few days ago, so there's not yet been enough time for all the input that I'm looking for in terms of estimates from the viewers on worm count. But eventually, after a couple check-ins, I'll eventually come back and make an announcement as to how many worms are thought to live in these systems. But just based on the early numbers I've gotten so far from viewers that watched the launch of these systems, the feedback has been pretty high in terms of how many worms are thought to live here. These little spheres of corn cob came over with the worms from their old home. And I'm not going to break them apart. I'm also not going to go too much out of my way to make sure they're not broken apart. But if I do bump into them and we're able to check them out, then I'm going to show you, but I'm not going to break them. So I found half of a mango seed over here. I would have to think that the other system also has one. As far as these corn cob spheres, I would think that there's probably a couple of them floating around here and there, but we're just going to leave that to chance. If we bump into them over time, then we'll get to look at them and see what we've got going on, but I'm not going to go out of my way looking for them. We're just going to proceed with giving these little guys their feeding and let them get back to work, let them be in peace. But as long as I'm busy doing this, let me just deviate really quickly to invite you to check out my last video. I can make it easy for you, and I could put a link up in the corner, right over here in the corner of the screen, so that you can just go check out that video and let me know how many worms you think live in these systems. If you comment here, I'm not going to consider that as a valid estimate, because what you saw here was two pretty busy bins with lots and lots of worms in them. But I like to kind of stick to a given process of getting feedback from the viewers on the launch videos. So I'm going to kind of stick to that, and if you haven't yet provided your estimate, then I invite you to go check out that video, follow the link that I'll leave for you, and then I'll make sure to include your estimate in the averaging calculation to make sure everyone's feedback is incorporated. So, I don't know what was fed to these systems last time, but I'm definitely catching the sense of something a little bit pungent, I don't know what it is, and it's a little bit unusual because normally worm bins don't really have a stinky kind of an odor, but perhaps something was placed into these systems that's, kind of kicking off an unpleasant smell. So I don't want to pretend that it's not happening when things like that are happening that are even a little bit unexpected or even undesirable. I'm always more than happy to clue you in on what's going on. I just sort of think it's more interesting to keep the viewers up to date with the good and the bad. So even though I smell something a little bit unpleasant, I'm not going to react to it. Before we cover up these pieces of bread, I've always found that putting bread that's not thoroughly dampened into the worm bins is going to cause it to just sit there and get really moldy, but the worms aren't going to be able to make a whole lot of use of it. So I just wanted to make sure that we're super generous on the application of moisture onto these chunks of bread, and you can see a lot of dust lifting up off of these chunks of bread as I dampen them. Those are definitely mold spores getting airborne. So it's a little bit gross. I'm trying not to breathe it in. But at least this way, I feel like these pieces of bread have a pretty good chance now of being broken down by the worms by being super damp. And now we can start giving them their food. I see some cucumber peel here There's a pretty good bit of it here, so let's make sure we share. And then I see grapes. I see plenty of tomatoes. Those are pretty obvious. There's chunks of celery here. This is also like the butt end of some celery. Oh, here's a nice big piece of cucumber as well. So we'll just see about divvying out this feeding pretty fairly. You can even see some lemon peel over here. Let's make sure both systems get a little bit of that as well. And I don't see too much tomato over here, so let's make sure both systems get a fair shake at the variety and the quantity. And I believe that now we've got a pretty evenly distributed feeding for these little guys. So in can go a little bit of grit to complement their food and any other things that we bumped into along the way. So let's just reach out to the outer edges to see what's happening out there. I don't really see a whole lot of action. It did seem to me like the middle of the system, which is where I would have left the food for them, is where the majority of the worm activity was. Not too surprising. I also don't think that I saw anything that resembled leftovers other than those slow composting objects, the corncob bits and the mango seed that would have come with the worms from their old home. So it does seem that I was selective enough in the initial feeding for these little guys to give them stuff that would not leave any leftovers. So they've done a good job breaking down what they were given last time, and hopefully they'll like what they were given here. Nice assortment of various fruits and veggies. Certain things like lemon peel I assume might take some time. Even the grapes. Lately I've seen instances where grapes are super popular and vanish quickly. Other times they just linger in the worm bins. But hey, these are brand new systems. There's plenty of time for stuff to break down here, so I'm in no rush. They'll get to it when they get to it. So that's pretty much it for our check-in here with a couple of my newer systems, only 12-day-old systems. And at some point soon, I'm going to be setting up the baiting process to try to round up the stragglers. Here's the half of a mango seed that this system had, which we failed to bump into until now. But I wasn't planning on really preparing a video about that. I mean, if we come back in here to feed these guys in another 10, 12, 14 days, I don't know how long, and we, by that point, do have a baiting setup going on in the containers that hold the castings that these little guys created in their old home, then perhaps we'll show it or feature it or something. Who knows? Maybe we'll even feel like it's time to haul the worms out and do a reuniting of the stragglers with the worms that live in here. So I just want to remind you, don't forget, there was that link I put up in the screen corner. And I definitely invite everyone to go check out the launch of these systems here. And I'm always very interested in hearing what people think in terms of how many worms are thought to occupy my systems. And like I said, I always take everyone's input, incorporate it into an averaging calculation, and that's how we're going to eventually come up together, all of us, with the estimated worm count for each of these systems. So please contribute your number. I definitely look forward to seeing your comments both in this video and on that video. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.